Hi, Lisa Schermerhorn here, and welcome to Lisa's Mindset Podcast. And I am thrilled and excited to introduce you to a friend of mine, Rob Dubin. And we met speaking at an event at Harvard through our mutual friend, Corey Poirier of Blue Talks. And I want to tell you that I sat and watched his talk, and he brought me to tears. He has an extraordinary life, extraordinary relationship with his wife, and he's had an incredible career that spanned a couple of different careers, would you say, in one? You were a film producer, then you went on and a television producer, film production, traveled the world on a sailboat, and he's speaking about happiness and experienced actually a life-threatening, incredible experience that will leave you all on your seat, so the edge of your seat. So I'm going to let Rob talk more about who he is and where he comes from. But the most important to me is his mindset. And something else that I talked to him before we started was what you'll also see as a theme is the extraordinary relationship he has with his wife and his dedication to her. And it's a quite a beautiful thing to witness. And she's lovely. And thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I know that as soon as we met, we clicked and felt a lot of synergy and a lot of high energy going between us. So I'm glad to be on your podcast with you, Lisa. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I know you're very busy. You just did your TED Talk and you're getting yourself out there, which is so exciting. And I wanted really to talk about your mindset, right? Because you have an extraordinary way of overcoming things and taking things head on. And I was wondering, because I throughout your childhood, if there was any defining moment or talk about something that, was defining where you were like, the way you think is a little different than other people think.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question. I don't get that very often, but there was actually maybe one of the most important life lessons I ever learned. I learned when I was 10 years old. And since we're doing a video podcast, your viewers can see that I'm bald, which doesn't seem too surprising in a guy my age. But what they wouldn't know is that I started going bald when I was in kindergarten. And I had these bald patches on my head when I was a little kid. And when I was really young, kindergarten, first grade, it wasn't a big deal. And, my friends would want to touch my head and then we'd, go on and play marbles or do whatever kindergartners do. But by the time I got into about fourth grade, I was getting teased unmercifully by the bigger bully kids in school. And one day I was on the playground and I was in fourth grade and these two sixth graders were taunting me and teasing me. And I just kind of lost it and I got tunnel vision. I heard this roaring in my ears and I ran at this one bully who was much bigger than me with my little 10-year-old fist swinging as hard as I could. And I don't really remember what happened for the next couple of minutes, but the next thing I do remember was the gym teacher, who was the playground monitor, picking me up off of this kid. And I had beat up both of these kids that were both much bigger than me. And they were both crying on the ground with bloody noses and black eyes. And I didn't have a mark on me. But the PE teacher picked me up and he looked at me and he said, "Rob, you don't even like those kids. Why do you care what they think of you?" And it was really one of the most important lessons that we can all learn in our life, is to live our lives for ourselves, not to try and please other people. And of course, Steve Jobs, in his very famous graduation speech that he gave, I believe at Stanford, when he was dying already, he talks very much about living your life for yourself, not trying to please other people or living it for what other people expect of you. And so I've always carried that thought with me throughout my life. And so I've made my life's decisions based on things that were going to make me happy. And so that's sort of how I always have lived my life. So I don't get that question very often about what I learned as a kid, but that lesson definitely sticks with me, and it's served me very well throughout my life.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it takes a lot of courage to do that, Because in order to find what makes you happy, first of all, you have to know what makes you happy, because a lot of people don't even know who they are, let alone what makes them happy, especially starting out. Number two, how many dream killers are there out there? And, especially in the arts, you went into film, right? And production. How many people actually pursue that and actually get to make a living at it and become successful at it?
Exactly. I mean, if I'd have done what my parents wanted, I would have become a lawyer or something, which is what they wanted me to do, and go to law school. And I was willing to chase my own dreams and not be swayed by what other people thought I should be doing. And I was lucky when I was in high school, I was 17 years old, and all my friends were applying to liberal arts colleges. And like most 17-year-olds, they all went on to change their majors 2 or 3 times along the way. And I was just very lucky. I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a communicator. I was into photography, and I later next got into filmmaking. So I applied to a film school, and I went directly from high school to film school. And directly out of film school, I started my own film production company. And later my wife joined me, and we got to work together and travel all over the world together. And she was a film producer. I was actually a director cameraman. And but we worked together, and we did a lot of work for, I did a lot of work for ABC TV and work for ESPN. We had our own series on ESPN and another one on the Travel Channel. And part of what led to my mindset, I believe, is that when I was first filming, and I was in my early 20s, and I got lucky. I got on with ABC Sports, doing a lot of sports documentaries. And I was by far the youngest person on the cruise doing this. But we were able to film, we did a lot of filming with some of the best mountain climbers in the world and the best skiers in the world. And of course, I filmed a few football games along the way. And so you're with the best NFL athletes. And later we did a lot of kayak shows, and I filmed the best whitewater kayakers. And particularly in those sports like climbing and kayaking and skiing, where you're not famous, not like an NFL football player, and they're totally only doing it for the love of what they do. And I think the mindset of the people that reach the peak in those sports, where I was filming them and interviewing them and going on these climbing expeditions to the Himalayas and Alaska with these people that were standouts in their endeavors, I think that's their mindset became my mindset in many ways. And I applied that to both my business, the way I approached filmmaking, and later on to the other endeavors I did in my own life.
So what is the mindset that's different than a daredevil like that? Someone who's like, you know, that adrenaline rush and needs to do those things that most people are scared of. I'm just curious, what is it that makes them tick that normal people don't have?
Well, I don't know that I wouldn't characterize it the way you've just characterized it, daredevil and all those things, because that's maybe how you see it. That's not how we see ourselves. So I've been a climber. I've climbed in the Himalayas and climbed Denali, the highest peak in North America, up in Alaska, and then later sailed my own sailboat around the world. And I have done all of those endeavors with safety foremost in my mind. I mean, we go to unbelievable extent to learn how to do the sport, to be proficient at it, to make it safe when we do it. But I guess we demand more of life than sitting on the couch with a six-pack of beer for our own fulfillment and satisfaction in life. So I don't think it's driven by the adrenaline rush of that. I think it's just driven by wanting to do more and see more and be more. And you can translate that into business, into being a great mom, into being a great parent, into being great at whatever job you do. You can bring that same approach to it. And I did. I mean, most of the people that I know that were successful in those other endeavors, they were also successful in business as well.
Right. You know what's interesting, and you said this so eloquently, it's the preparation. My ex-husband was a motorcycle racer. You know, he had lots and lots of motorcycles, but he was all about safety. And so, and all the prep and taking courses and learning all about it. Whereas when someone's proficient at something, they make it look so easy that, it looks like easy and effortless. And one of my closest friends was a photographer for the World Cup ski organization, and she would ski backwards with those giant lenses and, photograph these people going by her at, at 60, 70 miles an hour. And it takes a certain skill and ability, but she grew up on a ski mountain, so it was second nature to her. Whereas for someone else, I guess we all are good at something, right? It's just that those things that you pick are, to me, are there's a reason why it's riveting to watch, right? It's beautiful to watch someone doing something, going down the rapids, or watching someone, it keeps you on the edge of your seat.
Well, absolutely. And the way I got interested in that is I started mountain climbing. I grew up in Colorado and started hiking our 14,000 foot peaks. And this was when I was a youngster. We were back in the days of Kodak Instamatic cameras, which you could take a picture of this majestic mountain. And then when you got the picture back, the mountain was about a quarter-inch tall in the picture because they were all these wide angle cameras, point and shoot cameras. And so I wanted to convey the majesty of the nature that I had seen in real photographs that would really do that. So I started getting better cameras and learning how to do that better. And now, of course, we take it for granted because everybody has a unbelievably fantastic camera in their pocket on their phone. But that's what drove me first to wanting to do that, and then wanting to tell the story of climbing the mountains and that sort of thing.
So yeah, and so you're also an innate storyteller,
Without a
right?
doubt. I mean, I
Yeah.
I don't know that it's innate, but when I started making movies, that's what you learn. That's what it's all about. When you make documentaries, they're about telling stories. So I've been doing that for 40 years or something.
So what was it that finally made you decide I want to sell my business? I mean, you had two very successful, film businesses. How many people would just like, you know, dream of having that career? And then what was it that suddenly made you go, I've had enough, want to do something else now?
Well, there was one incident. Excuse me. Excuse me, Lisa. There was one incident which you know about from listening to my TED talk, and I guess I can recount that here. But my wife and I were on a backcountry ski trip to a cabin up in the mountains above Aspen, Colorado. And partway there, the weather changed dramatically, and it sort of turned into the storm of the century, one of the worst storms in Colorado history. And we had zero visibility for a while, and so we couldn't find the cabin we were headed towards. And we ended up spending 5 nights out, or 4 nights and 5 days out in the wilderness. And there was a rescue attempt going for us. And after the second day, the sheriff said there was less than a 10% chance that we could have survived. And then on the third day, he said it was just too dangerous because he didn't want to be sending live rescuers after our dead bodies. And then they decided they were going to call off the search for us, and the sheriff said that they would recover our frozen bodies the following spring. And that later that same day, we actually did get out of the wilderness, made contact with the rescuers, and we got out. And the first phone call I received after we got out was from the President of the United States, because the story had gone so viral that millions of people around the country had been following it day by day because the storm was so severe. It made the news all over the world, really. And, we survived. And so there was a lot of questions I was on the Today Show and Good Morning America, and they all asked the same kind of questions you're asking about mindset and how did we survive, and how did we have a will to survive. And it really comes down to optimism and resilience, that we never doubted that we would get out. It was very uncomfortable, and we didn't have any tents, we didn't have enough sleeping bags, and one woman left her sleeping bags, dropped it in the snow. So my wife gave her sleeping bag to the other woman, and it was, miserable, life-threatening conditions, but we never doubted that we would get out and survive.
So you were
And
with how many people?
well, there were 7 of us, but when the visibility went from a few hundred yards to like 6 inches very quickly. We ended up getting split up into three different groups, and it was quite a complex situation to explain. But my wife and I ended up with one other woman who was having a lot of trouble skiing, and so the others had gone on ahead because they didn't want to wait for this other woman. My wife and I waited for her, and eventually she had to drop her pack to be able to keep moving. And so the three of us ended up together for the next 3, 4 days out there, uh, just basically laying out in the snow with 2 feet of snow falling on us each night and 50-mile-an-hour winds kind of nonstop for 5 days. But we survived and we got out of it. And when we got out of it, it was wonderful to get back to civilization and the outpouring of, calls from everybody from the president to Oprah to all of our friends and family and people we'd known our whole, throughout our lives. But after we'd been back about 3 days, my wife had severe frostbite. She was in the hospital, and the doctors pulled me aside on the third night. So we had really just had 72 hours from getting out of the mountains to the third night that we were out. The doctors pulled me aside and told me that the tissues in my wife's feet and hands that were frostbitten were dying and gangrene was going to set in. And they told me they were going to have to amputate both of her feet. And then they said they would wait a few days and do a second surgery and amputate all of her fingers. And when they told me that, somehow I managed to stagger home. And when I walked in the door of our house, I opened the door and I happened to see a pair of my wife's running shoes there by the front door where she had taken them off. And when I saw that, my legs just collapsed and I fell to the floor, and I lay there all night long just crying uncontrollably, imagining what kind of bleak future awaited us. They were going to amputate my wife's feet and then all of her fingers, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I lay there all night long just crying uncontrollably, tears just pouring down my face, just holding myself in a fetal position. But when the morning sun came up, I jumped up with this smile on my face, and I raced to the hospital to talk to my wife before the doctors could tell her their diagnosis. And I ran in and I told her she was going to have a complete recovery. And from that moment onward, that's all that both of us focused on, was a complete recovery. And the decision that we made that day was that we were going to be happy. And regardless of the outcome, we decided we were going to be happy. Not happy if she recovered or when she recovered, but that we were going to be happy and have happy lives as we had always focused on. And that's the thing that had changed for me while I lay there crying on the floor. Sometime between, around 4 or 5 in the morning, I finally drifted off to sleep. And when I did, my subconscious mind took over, and it did for me what it had been doing my entire life. It decided to be happy. And so that's the decision that we made in that moment. And that's really an important life moment for me, because I realized that throughout our lives, happiness is actually a decision we make. It's not something that happens to us when we check all the right boxes in life. We tend to think, when we get the good education and we get the good job and we meet the right partner and we have the cute kids, happiness will fall out of the sky on us. And it doesn't work that way. It's a decision we make every single day on how we want to live our lives. And then we look for and do the things that will create that happiness. And so that's the decision that my wife and I made that in that moment. And we focused on our own happiness. We didn't have any idea what was going to be the outcome. But a couple hours later, when the doctors came in to prep her for the surgery, we tore up those papers and we refused to sign the papers authorizing the surgery. And we just hoped and decided to be optimistic and resilient, just as we had been out in the wilderness when we were stuck out in the snow. And we decided to see if our optimism and resilience could lead to a different outcome than the doctors were predicting. And The doctors were incredible. They gave her amazing care, and she had a really long way to go, but day by day and literally millimeter by millimeter, more of her feet began to turn from this ghastly black and purple color, and they began to turn pink again. And it took a whole year for her to recover. She was 21 days in the hospital, months and months at home recovery. But a full year after that night that I had lay on the floor in by my front door, we took a victory trip to Mexico, and Dee was dancing in the sand on the beach, and she had 2 feet and 10 fingers and 9.5 toes.
So extraordinary, but let me go back to the hospital, because that could not have been an easy conversation, because I've had friends who've been given very grave diagnoses and ended up having to go and fight with their doctors. So I'm curious, what was it that got these doctors to agree with them, or did you just have these doctors that were willing to support you right away?
No, it was not that. And to paint the full picture, to put it in context, I told you how our story had gone viral. So there were millions of people watching us. That's why the president called and Oprah called when we got out. That's why I was on the Today Show and Good Morning America and Fox. And I was on the Today Show 2 days in a row, sort of unheard of. And the doctors there were satellite trucks parked outside of the hospital, and the doctors were having to hold press conferences telling what they were going to do. So we put them in a terrible, terrible position when we did this. And I have to say, my father is a physician. And my first jobs when I was 14, 15 years old up to 18 were working in a hospital. That my dad was able to help me get a job there. So I have a huge respect for the medical community. We are not religious, we're not spiritual, we're not into alternative medicine. And so it was not any of those other things, but we just felt that there was maybe another way. And I have to say, we had done a lot of work with Tony Robbins. We had done Tony Robbins' Fire Walk. And I don't know how the Fire Walk works, but we walked through hot coals. I don't know literally how it works, but I know I've done it. And so I figured if we could walk through fire, maybe we could walk through ice without hurting ourselves. So when we told the doctors that, there were two doctors taking care of her. One was the wound care doctor. The other was the plastic surgeon who was actually going to do the amputations. And we told the first one, and he kind of walked out of the room and didn't know what to do. And then about 20 minutes later, the second one came in, also with the nurse with the papers for us to sign. And we had a short conversation with him, and they were kind of baffled. And so then a few minutes later, a third doctor came in who we hadn't seen him before, and he introduced himself as the hospital's psychiatrist. So he actually listened for quite a while to what we had to say, and that we had been through other things, and we had done the fire walk, and we had just survived when they said on day 2 that there was a 10% chance of us surviving, and we got out on day 5. So we had just defied the experts' predictions as well. And so we were at this kind of standoff with the doctors, and we didn't know how it was going to be resolved. And that night, I ended up in the hospital cafeteria line next to her doctor, the plastic surgeon. And there was sort of this uncomfortableness as we looked at each other. And then he got checked, paid for his meal and walked out. And I was next, and I went over and I said, "Do you mind if I sit down with you?" And he said, "Yes." And when we sat down over the meal, we were not doctor and patient. We were just two human beings. And he listened to my thoughts and what we had been through. And of course, he said, I have a huge respect for what you've already overcome. And he had seen Dee already in the 3 days, the kind of spirit she had. And over the meal, he said, "Well, we think she's going to get gangrene. And if she does, she's going to lose more. We have to amputate farther up the leg." And I said to him, "Look, if she gets gangrene, I will sign the papers immediately. We will not, there won't be any discussion." And so he and I shook on that. If she got gangrene, she had to have surgery to save her life. And if she didn't get gangrene, then we were going to wait. And it turns out that they gave her incredible care, and she never got gangrene. Yeah. And, to Dee's credit, we were sitting there during the first couple of days before they had said this. we were all sitting there in the hospital room, and all of a sudden Dee started jumping like she had gotten an electric shock, literally like she had put her fingers in a light socket, and her whole body twitched and jumped. And the doctor said, "Oh, that's your nerves like regenerating." He said, and he just turned to the nurse immediately. He said, "Let's put her on a IV drip of morphine drip." And Dee just blurted out, "No." And then the doctor said, "Well, it's your nerves. You're going to have those jolts like all the time. It's just way going to be super painful." And she said, "No, that's life coming back into my body." And she refused the morphine drip.
Wow.
And she went for the next months with those kind of jolts happening multiple times a day, every day for months. But to her, she reframed it in her mind as not pain, but as life coming back. And when the doctor saw her do that, it changed how he saw, the outcome as well, the possible outcome.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And I've walked fire myself. I walked 40 feet of red hot coals. And the idea of it is your mind, because if you are depressed, you should never walk, because the whole idea is everything has a chi, which is your energy force, right? The fire has its own energy force. And the important thing is to keep your energy force at the same level or higher than the fire. You won't get burned. If your energy level is low, that's why I haven't done Tony Robbins, but if you're with Tony Robbins, they play loud music and they get you pumped. The whole thing is to have your mind and get you excited and moving so that your energy level is high and higher or equivalent to the fire.
Exactly. And that's why Dee, not wanting to be drugged on drugs, she wanted her energy very high for her healing, and she healed herself. The doctors gave her incredible care. They put her in a hyperbaric chamber like they use for scuba divers that get the bends, and they basically just filled this chamber with oxygen. So the oxygen, her blood vessels could not carry were constricted so much they couldn't carry blood to her tissues, but this just literally forced the oxygen from the outside right into her tissues. And they did that to her twice a day for several weeks. And Tony is a friend of ours, and Tony Robbins called her, and he talked to her about how to think about her recovery, and he sent her some tapes from his friend Deepak Chopra, and she went into this hyperbaric chamber and listened to audio cassette tapes from Deepak twice a day, and over months she healed herself. And so she had that recovery. And I won't say it was a cataclysmic, eye-opening event for us on our lives, because we were already living our best lives. We were already traveling all over the world together, making movies, and we loved what we did, but we still thought there was maybe something more. So that's when we sold our home and bought a sailboat, and we took off to go sailing. And we ended up spending the next 17 years living on our sailboat, sailing around the world, visiting about 100 different countries, and along the way studying more and more about what created human happiness. And so that's now what I speak on. During the pandemic, when I realized so many people were so unhappy with the lives they were leading, that I came out of retirement and started a new career speaking about employee happiness, but also I work with a lot of corporations on employee happiness and avoiding burnout and how to re-engage their employees. So that's what I do now, is I speak at HR conferences and in corporate settings on employee engagement and happiness.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And I think so many people have a lot to learn, mindset. So many people just get up in the morning and it's like robots. There's a song, Ants Marching. His name just escaped me, was there and then it left. But, it's like going through that same every day. And, again, when you talked about, you get married, you have your kids, you have your career, and then you're supposed to be happy. And it's not about, and instead of following that passion, that why, which is a lot of the work that I do, is helping people find their why and their purpose, because without that, there's no reason to get up in the morning. And I'm curious, because 17 years is a lot of time on a sailboat. I used to sail and it's tight quarters. And I've seen waves come up and some treacherous things happen on the water. I'm curious, do you have any really harrowing experiences in your sailing experience on the water?
Well, we went through a hurricane our second year out sailing, and we went through really in the lots of small storms and three really big storms. But as a friend of mine who's a single-handed sailor used to say, you have to learn to separate life-threatening from extremely uncomfortable. And a lot of times it's really
And
in the
very wet.
yeah, it's in the extremely uncomfortable category a lot of the time, but or some of the time.
Yeah.
But somebody asked me what's the what do I need to learn to be a sailor like you guys were? I said, well, the best thing is to have a short memory so that you can forget the bad times and then you remember the good ones. And of course, Ted Lasso is now it's part of our culture now. And Ted Lasso talks about being a goldfish because they have a 30-second memory. So, I've worked on forgetting the bad times and then techniques for remembering the times that create that happiness. And so you can get re in touch with those happy, fulfilling moments in your life. And a lot of what we talk about is gratitude and in teaching happiness. That's a big part of it, of course.
Gratitude is everything because there's a big difference of being a victim versus being in the state of gratitude. And I see it all the time in my own work is that when people look at, what is God doing to me instead of for me? And, whether you're religious or not, if you believe in God or whatever, I always believe that there's a divine, and for me, it's always been there's a divine process of what happens, how everything kind of flows from one thing to another. And if I can look back in my life of how everything just showed up, in retrospect, I didn't see it moving forward, but I look back and I see how everything happened for a reason and everything kind of built on top of each other and how each lesson just took me to a whole nother level. And, I look at the things that you've done. I'm curious because when you travel around the world, you bump into a lot of amazing cultures. And there are different countries that say this is the happiest culture, the happiest place on earth. I'm curious, what were your favorite countries that you visited, and what was it about those places that, were, just etched in your mind as your favorite?
Well, as we were sailing around the world, of course, we had people ask that question to of us many, many times. They would always ask, "What's your favorite country?" And my wife would always answer the next one.
Yeah.
And
Was there some? Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
well, anyway, so that was always her answer. But I would say one of our favorite countries is Thailand. We've been back since, a number of times. We lived there for 3 years on our boat, and the people are quite incredible. But we found lots and lots of cultures that we admired one thing or another about for sure.
Beautiful, beautiful. What was the greatest lesson that you had on that sailing trip for 17 years? That's a lot from a standpoint of you know what? I want to go your relationship. Before we got on the call, before I recorded, I talked about this the fact that, being in a relationship and being in tight quarters, you guys worked together, you helped each other through so much. And I had the opportunity and the privilege to meet your wife and to see the two of you together. And it actually gets me emotional when I start to talk about it because the two of you really do have a really beautiful relationship. And when I said relationships are work, and then you said to me, we have never had, that's never been the case in our relationship. And I'd like to talk, you to talk about that and how, you know, how that's impacted your life and to be able to work together and live together and just do all of these things together.
Well, we did start working together right after we got together. Dee was she was a construction superintendent building big condominium developments. And she joined me in my film business not long after, because I said the skill set of producing a movie is the same skill set as producing a condominium. It's keeping track of a ton of details and all that sort of thing, and lots of subcontractors and all that. So we started working together right away in our relationship. And it was a really good experience, because if you were at home and you got in a disagreement with your spouse, and then you went to work and that same person was there, you better figure out how to communicate, and vice versa. If you got in a disagreement with your business partner and you go home and there's that same person. So we learned to communicate really well very early in our relationship. And, one of the things that we all have rules for life, things that we think are the right way to do something or the wrong way to do something. And your rules are different than my rules. What's okay to say to somebody, what's not okay to say to somebody, what's polite, what's impolite. Like when we travel to different cultures, some cultures, you couldn't touch somebody on the head. That was a taboo. Other cultures, pointing your feet towards someone were taboo. So every culture has different rules and things that are okay and not okay, and we each all do in our own lives. So you think one thing is okay, and I don't think that thing is okay. And if we make each other wrong for those judgments, we're just setting ourselves up for disappointment and frustration. And so one of the things I teach in How to Be Happier is to stop judging other people so much and be curious about them. And one of the things that has kept our relationship fresh and wonderful, despite being together 24/7 for months and months and months at a time, is that something can happen and Dee will have a completely different response to it than I do. And I don't make her wrong for having a different response. I
Yeah,
stop and say, that's interesting. Why does she see it that way and not? And maybe I should see it the way she does. And I don't judge her for it. And an amazing thing happens when you stop judging other people. You can actually maybe stop judging yourself so harshly.
that's something that I also teach a lot, is that when you're getting in judgment, you're really, when you're judging, you're pointing the finger at someone else, but you've got three fingers pointing back at you, and then you're projecting your own stuff onto someone else. When you allow people to just be and honor that that's their map of the world, right? My upbringing was different than your upbringing. So I always say it's like putting a pair of glasses on. The lens that I see the world through is very different than the lens you see the world through. So it's important to honor that everyone's seeing everything from a different perspective. And that crazy part is that everyone's right. There is no wrong.
Absolutely. That's a
And
beautiful thing that you teach.
yeah. And so when people, and it's interesting what I've started to do, and is that when I come up against someone who has a very different perspective on something, I do something called a reframe, where I put myself in their place. And I ask how are they seeing the world? And I look and I go in, and it happens in a split second for me now, because it's second nature. How are they seeing the world that's different from the way I'm seeing the world? And how can I come to terms with that in my own values, my own structure of how I live my life day to day? And can I just let it go? Is it that important? Because so many people are wrapped up in control. They have to be right.
That's a very important point. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be in a relationship?
Right.
And one of the other things that we talk about, and I actually wrote a little book. I mean, I'm not a marriage counselor by any stretch of the imagination, but surprisingly, when I started speaking about our 17 years on the boat, the second most common question was, how did the two of you get along 24/7 in a small space? And so I actually wrote a little ebook on our secrets of marriage. Like I say, I'm not a marriage counselor, but things that worked for us. And I'll just share one of them because I know it's resonated with a lot of people. And if you hear the idea of, well, I'll meet you halfway, and so you're both going to compromise halfway. The problem is, where you think the middle is and where I think the middle is are different. And so if I say I'm going to go meet you halfway, I'm really only going 40% of the way. And if you say you're going to go halfway, you're only going 40%. So we're still 20% apart.
Not only
And
that,
so
now you're resenting each other, right?
exactly. So I say you got to meet each other 75%, go 75% of the way to the other person's way of thinking or whatever the compromise is, go 75% of the way. And if you each go 75%, you'll probably meet somewhere in the middle.
I have a metaphor story. My ex-husband and I moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we had this house and we were trying to decorate it. We had young children and it was very unique and special architecture. And we realized we both had a little bit different tastes, and we were arguing over what we wanted this one music room to look like and this dining room to look like. And someone gave me the most brilliant advice. They said, if you compromise on both the rooms, you're only gonna like it halfway, right? Neither one of you are gonna walk into those rooms and love it. Each of you pick a room and make it really unique and special for yourself. And so we did that. And then I had a room that I loved. He had a room that he loved. And then what happened was his room grew on me and my room grew on him. And we both ended up loving each other's rooms that we decorated. And I know it sounds like a silly story, but I go back to that metaphor a lot. Was, that compromise to 75%. It's just like, the compromise was you get your room, I get my room, but we both ended up with something much greater because we compromised that way.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful story.
Yeah. So anything coming up? I know, is there anything else? I know you've had so many extraordinary. Now I know you're back, you and your wife are skiing again, right? After that whole thing, you live on a ski mountain and you're skiing again?
Oh, definitely. We never stopped skiing. I got asked on the Today Show, and this is in my TED Talk if people are interested. A couple things have come up that people might want to watch my TED Talk. I have a story in the TED Talk about the same idea you were talking about so even the negative events in your life have led to positive things that you talked about how one thing had led to another. And I have a little practice I talk about in my TED Talk on how people can reinvent their old stories of their past that are holding them back. Because we all have negative stories that we pick up as we go through life. And a lot of times those can prevent us from finding our current happiness. So when I do these employee happiness teachings that I do, if I do a workshop for a corporation, I actually start with not how you can be happy today and in the future, but how to rewrite your past so that you're happier in your past. And that's where it starts. So that's something you mentioned earlier, that if people want to find my TED Talk, you can put it in the show notes. There's a little strategy there.
I
And
will. I will do that. And it's interesting because I'm actually a certified hypnotist, a hypnotherapist. And what I do is when I take people back into their past, they have the opportunity. You can't change what happened, but you can go back and change how you feel about something. So when you change the emotions that are related to that particular incident, it changes everything. And then people have trouble remembering. Sometimes people are like, I don't even remember what that was.
well, it's that's a beautiful thing that you do in your hypnotherapy practice. And I tell people, one of the quotes that I say during my talks is that the experience of our lives isn't what actually happens to us. It's how we think about what happens to us. So the experience of our lives isn't what happens to us, it's how we think about what happens to us. And happy people think differently. So when you go through this training that I do and you start to focus on your own happiness, you actually think differently. So you think about the things that you're living, that you're experiencing in a different way, and it contributes to your happiness every day. And then the other thing you had asked me about what we learned as we traveled over the 17 years of time. And I would say we kind of went through 3 different phases as we sailed. And the very first phase was what I call the don't die phase. And that was the first year or 2 years on the boat. where, we were learning how to do everything, learning how to be safe, learning how not to run aground or get in a storm, or what to do if we did get in a storm. And our focus was completely inward. It was totally about us, about learning what we needed to do. We were focused on what would work for us and wouldn't work for us. And it was really a totally inwardly focused life for a couple of years. And then the next phase was kind of a mutual benefit phase. Maybe we were focused on the people we were visiting. We always carried school supplies for the kids and tools that I could give away to the men, or fish hooks, and the women often wanted sewing supplies. So we always carried all that kind of stuff, and we gave it away, and it benefited their lives, but it also benefited us because they invited us into their lives and we could see how they lived and have interactions with them. And so we did that for quite a few years, where we were kind of exchanging what their world is and what our world was, and what we could give them from our world. And that was maybe in the next few years of our sailing. But before too much time had passed, we kind of entered the third phase, which was really about what we could contribute to others. And that's kind of how we then went on for the rest of the 17 years. It was really about arriving at a new place and seeing how we could contribute to somebody else's life. And we had a lot of opportunities to do that. And in one place, we arrived in Indonesia, at this kind of medium-sized city, our first port of call in Indonesia after we left Australia. And this young woman met us on the beach, and she wanted to practice her English. So she offered to be our guide all through the town and show us where the market was and everything else. And this young girl was just so personable and so smart. And if she'd been in the US, she'd have been on a full ride scholarship to Harvard.
Wow.
And her parents made about $200 a year, and $200 a month. And they couldn't afford to send her to school or anything. But luckily, she had gotten a scholarship to go to a school. And so she was learning English and studying to be a teacher. And she was so amazing and inspirational for us that we knew there must be so many other young women like herself that had no chance of a college education. And so we reached out to the other sailors like ourselves, just itinerant sailors passing through, and we decided to see if we could raise a little money to help her out. And over time, this idea that we had sort of snowballed, and we were only in this town for about 7 or 8 days, but we decided to start a scholarship for young women. And we went to the president of the university where she was going, and he agreed to waive all the entrance requirements for anybody that we would sponsor. And then we went to the headmasters of the 2 largest high schools, and we set up a criteria for selecting students, mostly women. We did grant some young men, but mostly women, both on academic achievement and financial need. And then we set up a system with just itinerant sailors like ourselves passing through would be able to donate to a scholarship program, because we knew all the other sailors felt exactly as we did as they had traveled. They really just wanted to be about contribution. And we've started that in 2007. And so far we've sent 29 kids through 5 years of college now. So that's been one of the best things that came out of our 17 years of cruising, for sure.
Wow. Well, I think people now, after hearing you, will understand why I was so excited to interview you.
Well, thank you for having me.
No, you're an extraordinary man, and I just feel so blessed to know you and you and your wife. And I'm going to have links below for people who want to hire you or have you come speak or do workshops in their companies, and listen to your TED Talk and have this great inspiration from you, because you are an extraordinary human being. And I want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I've certainly enjoyed it, and you're special in my heart. And I'll make a little ebook I have available to your listeners if they want to text. If they text the word happier to 33777, and you can maybe put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
I'll have an ebook that they can download, and we'll give them some of the techniques that we've talked about here and a few other practical tips to start creating more happiness in their own lives, because that's really why I started speaking and doing what I do, is when I realized there were just a lot of unhappy people in the world, and I'd like to reach as many of them as I can and help them find more happiness.
Beautiful. So it's happier 33777?
33777 and the word happier. Yeah, if they text that, they'll
Okay.
be able to download a little ebook.
Okay, it'll be in the notes, and I want you to hang on and thank you again.